With the baby blues, we're really expecting this in the first month, and it doesn't usually last beyond that. We then have a few clinical diagnoses that we're thinking about. So postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, postpartum OCD, postpartum rage. These are things that usually start within the first year. It doesn't need to be in the first few weeks. Again, there's a really large number of women who are going through this. It's actually 1 in 5 right now. And I think the better we get at assessing, we'll see this number go up even more.
Welcome, guys, to a whole new episode of Tell Me Why, which is a Gulf News original podcast. For those of you who've been listening to us lately, you know that we ask each guest a Tell Me Why question. It's a unique question for each of our guests because we like to dig deeper when it comes to certain topics. We don't like to settle for those, cliche, vague answers that we can get, either from a textbook or from the internet. We like to dig deeper. We like to give you the answers that you need. Joining us in the studio is Dr. Summer, who is a clinical psychologist at LightHouse Arabia and the lead for Women's Health Services. And today we're going to be discussing postpartum depression, which has been a buzzword for quite some time. And we feel like more and more women are coming forward with their challenges postpartum. And we thought this is a great opportunity to start the conversation and to get more information about postpartum challenges for both women and their partners. Dr. Summer, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Maria.
So tell us a bit more about Women's Health Services and how you got into that.
Sure. So recently, just in the past 6 months, the LightHouse Arabia, we've recognized in our clinic that there's been a real need to support women in the community. So we know that women go through particular life experiences that make them more vulnerable to mental health difficulties. Only one of these is going through childbirth and the postpartum period. But we also think about, the experience of a teenager getting her period, and we go through PMS every month and certain women's cancers, for example, that make us more vulnerable, and menopause. So we recognize that there's a real need in our community. And although we'd been specialized in supporting women for a long time, we wanted to make it clear to everyone that the help is out there if they need it. And one of my passions has been women in the postpartum period, or maternal mental health, which is the mental health of a mother at any stage in her journey as a mother, even in the journey to becoming a mother, thinking about fertility and things like that. So I got into this. Again, it's been on my mind and it's been a passion of mine. It's been dear to my heart as a woman myself, being in a community of strong women. But the way I started coming into psychology was working with children primarily. So I worked with children for many years, actually more than 15 years now.
Wow.
I've been working with children, supporting children with a variety of their needs. And what I realized in that work more and more was that the more we could get parents on board, the more we saw effective change in therapy. So then I started to involve parents more in my work, and more over time I recognized that the parents' mental health is the center of a child's mental health.
Of course.
And that seemed, I had heard that before, but it only came to life, I think, when I became a parent about 2 years ago. And I started to really recognize the value of this first year of life, the pregnancy period, the journey of a mother, and how important and central that is to the family's happiness. So that's what brought me to maternal mental health, and then recognizing with a group of clinicians at the Lighthouse that we wanted to start this team for our community.
That's wonderful. I think a major part of that as well is educating the community and educating parents on the importance of mental health, because you were saying, a lot of like the child's mental health depends on the parents' mental health. It is a ripple effect. It is what you instill in your child, unfortunately, and we do have a great responsibility towards our children, more than just providing them with food, the basic needs. It's also their mental health. Have you found it challenging educating parents when it comes to that area?
I think in a way it's instinctive. It's almost intuitive that every mother knows this deep down, because that's our true. And when our child is born, we're basically one person, right? We're physically one person, and our hormones are linked, the co-regulation of the heartbeat. We all know this is connected. So intuitively, we know how we feel affects how our child feels. Sometimes I think some parents who have a very strong internal critic or self-blame narrative may become defensive about this in a way and say, it's not my fault, or kind of project the problem somewhere else. This is what my child is doing. So naturally, there's going to be some resistance with some particular people, but everyone's different. And I think a mother or a parent who is coming to a psychology service naturally has a level of openness already to this idea. So typically I've found people are really open to it and really willing to work on themselves.
That's fantastic. Okay, so let's dive into our topic because it is a special one, and it is one that we cannot talk about enough. I think there's always more to talk about when it comes to postpartum depression or challenges in general. It doesn't always have to lead to depression. So before we get started, can you just define what postpartum depression is, or what are the challenges?
Yes, definitely. I think this is really important that we go into a bit of detail about this, because one of the questions is what's in the typical range and what's going into the clinical range. And there's so much overlap. Any mother is going to be spending less time socializing with friends, is going to be having disturbed sleep, is going to be having disturbed eating, because that's the nature of being postpartum, while at the same time, those are some of the symptoms of postpartum depression. So I'll try and clarify and define a few different terms that might help the listeners understand the differences. So the first one is baby blues, which is typically within the first month of having a baby. A mother, in 80% of cases, so you can really say this is the norm, the majority of mothers will experience mood fluctuations, low mood, feeling really sad, tearfulness, things that they might have never really experienced in their life. They might have always considered themselves to be an emotionally relatively stable person. But because of this huge surge in hormones and the seismic shift of the nature of having a child, it's really natural to have big emotions during this time. But with the baby blues, we're really expecting this in the first month, and it doesn't usually last beyond that. We then have a few clinical diagnoses that we're thinking about. So clinical would be postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, postpartum OCD, postpartum rage. These are things that usually start within the first year. It doesn't need to be in the first few weeks. It can start up even 2 months after. It could start up 3 months after. But with postpartum depression, again, there's a really large number of women who are going through this. It's actually 1 in 5 right now. And I think the better we get at assessing and women feel more comfortable speaking up, we'll see this number go up even more, that women are truly experiencing clinical depression in the first year of motherhood.
That's a shocking statistic, 1 in 5.
It is. So I know every mother can probably think of 5 mothers who had babies in the same year, and at least 1 in 5. So that's really a huge number. So what we expect with postpartum depression is a mix of physical, cognitive, as in thoughts, behavioral changes, emotional changes. So, for example, on the emotional side, we might have a mother that's very tearful, but it might not only appear as sadness. It might appear as, severe mood fluctuations, a lot of irritability, difficulty maintaining their relationships. Behaviorally, they might become very withdrawn, refusing to go out, not enjoying the same things that they used to. To a certain extent, we expect some of this with every mother, but it's usually a partner or a family member who starts saying, my partner isn't acting like themselves anymore. It's very common to start blaming yourself for things. So saying, I'm not a good enough mother, it's my fault. This very negative inner critic can become very intense. severe sleep disturbances. So, for example, you have the opportunity to sleep. We know every mother is very sleep deprived, but even with that opportunity, they're not able to sleep. Again, there's a lot of overlap with anxiety. Postpartum anxiety is also very common. The statistics aren't as clear, but it might be around 15% as well. And anxiety can look like obsessions, obsessive thoughts, intrusive thoughts, thoughts of harming your child. There's a lot of fear that happens around that.
And we have seen a lot of stories, sorry to cut you off, but we have seen a lot of stories of women harming their children and themselves, potentially.
Yes, so there is risk, and I think many women start naturally then having a lot of fear that they might do something negative or something bad might happen to their child. And we're always looking for what's the impact of that. So rather than only looking at the symptom itself, what's the impact? Does it mean that the mother is no longer able to care for the baby? Or are they avoiding diaper changes or avoiding looking after the child or avoiding taking them out because of all the fear? So again, it's really natural. I can say from personal experience, it's really natural to have intrusive thoughts. That's a really common part of becoming a mother. A lot of fears about our child and what's best for them. But is it impacting it to the extent that it's negatively affecting how you can function as a mother?
Right. So you were saying out of experience. Can you tell us about your experience, your postpartum experience?
Yes, sure. I did want to say before we go into that there's one more area, which is postpartum psychosis,
right?
Which is a separate diagnosis and also a very serious condition to consider.
Yes.
And for those mothers to just be looking out for delusions, so lots of paranoia, hearing things that other people can't hear, seeing things that other people can't see. And this does need to be treated immediately by a psychiatrist. And it is a treatable condition, the same as postpartum depression and anxiety. They are treatable conditions, but the help is really needed at that point.
That's fantastic. That was actually one of our listeners' questions. So you answered that right off the bat. So thank you for that. All right. So we can then get into your experience as a mother. Yeah.
Definitely. So like I said, becoming a mother, it opened my eyes to so much. I had already, of course, been a psychologist and understood emotions come and go. There's waves of emotions. I was working with children anyway.
Right.
But I don't think I ever fully processed the intensity of the emotions. And I think I told myself for so long, I'm a psychologist, so I can handle this.
Yeah.
I know I have the training. I have all the rules, the shoulds and shouldn'ts.
Yeah.
In a way, I think that set me up for a little bit, even for everyone it's different, but even more of an internal critic to saying you should be doing it this way and not that way, and how come you're not doing it the right way. I see this with so many mothers, that the all of our suffering comes from judgment.
Of course.
From setting our expectations unrealistically high. I think I went into motherhood like many women do, with this idea of what the perfect mother is.
Right.
And the sad reality is that I never was even close to meeting that.
Yes.
And no one is. It's really a painful experience to have to sit with that. I think there were different points for me that were challenging. For some women, it can be very early on. It's interesting. Some women will find, for example, the idea of sleeping together is too much. For some women, the idea of sleep training is too much. I don't want to do that. So everyone is so different with their experience of what's normal and what's expected and their own history and culture. For me, one of the hardest things I remember was going back to work, making the decision to go back to work.
Yes.
And the pain of just not knowing what's right for my child. And I can't be, as I said, perfect.
Yes.
And no one is going to be able to tell me if this is right or wrong. And no one will be able to say with certainty, your child's going to be just fine.
Yes, exactly.
So we all have to sit with this discomfort of not having the exact answer. So that stirred up a lot in me around questions around identity. I think many parents go through this. Am I this type of mother? Should I make this decision? Should I breastfeed? Should I stop breastfeeding? Should I bottle feed? What kind of bottle?
Yes.
There's so many questions, and I think the reality is very hard to prepare for the reality that we don't have the exact answers.
Yes.
There might be some answers out there, but reality is there's information, but the answer is with you as a mother. You know the answer for you and your child. So it's reconnecting back to our intuition, which we've been really disconnected from, I think, for a long time.
You know, it's interesting that you mention two things that I wanted to actually elaborate on. One, the perfect mother. I remember my mom telling me this piece of advice. I'm not yet a mother, but I remember her telling me, do not compare yourself to someone else. Don't compare yourself to me. She kept telling me, as a mother, I went through so many things that you may have not seen as a child. The perfection does not exist. And I remember that resonated with me. And I think I will keep reminding myself of that if I can, and if I'm able to. I will remind myself that as a child, I didn't see the challenges. I saw the mother that, you know, did everything she could for us and, you know, was always there. The house was perfect. She was always there for my father. She was always there for us. And that doesn't exist. Behind that, there was a lot of pain. There was a lot of challenge. And when you spoke about work, I think that was one of the major aspects that I saw my friends go through, the guilt that came with going back to work, with feeling like they failed their children because they have to spend, 6-7 hours away from their kids to go to work and then come back, catch them for 2 hours before their bedtime. That guilt was so painful. How did you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because I think we all experience guilt to a certain extent. And guilt, if we talk about guilt itself, true guilt, is actually can be quite helpful. You know, I did something wrong, I'll correct it, and that's okay. But I think the epidemic we're facing is actually mom shame. It's not necessarily mom guilt, because we normalize mom guilt. We all have it. It's okay. It comes and it goes. It tells me what to do or not to do. With mom shame, we are getting more at a personal level where we're telling ourselves it's not something that I'm doing wrong that I can correct. It's that I am a bad mother. I'm not a good enough mother. My child deserves better than me. You know, those things, shame is really painful. And I think most of our suffering comes from that shame and judgment of ourselves. All I can say is it's an ongoing journey. When I talk about myself, it's something I'm really working on, because what happens in motherhood, the same as what happens in a couple relationship or in a parent-child relationship or in a friendship, it's not necessarily about the child. It's about an internal struggle that has pre-existed the child. So there was an internal critic inside of me, which I never really heard too much of until I became a parent. But that helps me realize I need to work on myself and my own self-development and my own self-love and self-acceptance. And actually it doesn't have so much to do with my daughter. It's simply my relationship to myself that needs working. And then when we can get clear on that, when we feel more at peace with ourselves, we become much clearer on what's right for me, what direction should I go in. And the internal chatter and tension resolves a little bit. But I would like to say I love what your mother said to you. It's so lovely to have, you know, someone in your life who's able to tell you the truth of what motherhood is, because there's so much hidden, I think, in what we see and hear. We don't know that people struggle like we do, and we strive for perfection. And unless we hear it from our mothers, who you turned out fine, and you're like, okay, this is not that bad. It's really hard to be on the path and feel that there is something that you're doing wrong.
And because we safeguard our kids from so much that we think is going to harm them in some way. And, you know, when they get older, we can be a bit more real with them, which is probably why. Okay, so diving into the technical side of postpartum depression or postpartum OCD or anxiety, what are the chemical or imbalances, let's say, or the physical implications that it has on a woman's body?
Yes, sure. So the thing is, you know, our minds and our bodies are so connected. They are one. We know that. the chemical, there's so much happening at the chemical level. When we give birth, the surge of oxytocin and all of the stuff that then triggers breastfeeding. So we know at a physical level there's a lot going on. It genuinely does change our brain chemistry. We know, for example, the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that signals if there's a danger, that in the activity in that part of the brain changes after you give birth, because a woman becomes very sensitive and aware of danger. So a baby's cry becomes a chemical reaction in the brain to say there's something wrong, which leads to physical symptoms, which also, physical symptoms of cortisol running in your body. And then that impacts your interest in eating and your sleep, but then also causes psychological difficulties. You feel anxious, you feel worried that you're doing something wrong. So that's just one example of how the physical and the emotional are one.
Right.
So there is as you know, big change in hormones and chemicals in our body. Our physical body is recovering from birth, so many women are experiencing pain or might have experienced a traumatic birth, which puts them at risk of experiencing postpartum depression or big emotions. So there's the chemical side, the hormone side, and similar to any other depression, there might be a change in serotonin, and that's why some medication can have a really helpful impact for mothers who are experiencing depression. On the physical side, we notice changes in their eating, in their sleeping, on their their weight, for example, can change. But there are a few things that can put a woman at higher risk for postpartum depression. One of them is a traumatic birth. Another is a difficult relationship with her mother, because we start to psychologically, we relive many of our relationships and our early wounds. So early life trauma can resurface. Grief, again, can resurface. Grief, loss of a parent, loss of a previous child can resurface. A history of depression. If the pregnancy was unplanned, that can sometimes also put a parent at risk. But I don't want to say that too concretely, because I also see many women who have been trying for so long to get pregnant, put years of work into getting on this journey of motherhood and still experience depression. So being depressed has nothing to do with whether you want your child or not, or whether you're a good mother or not. So I think that's really important to clarify.
Of course. So from your experience as a clinical psychologist and someone that's focusing on women's health recently, can you tell us, of course, without getting into specifics or details, but can you tell us about certain cases that have actually successfully overcome, the challenges that they faced or the depression that they went through postpartum?
Definitely. I mean, the wonderful thing, I think, about the nature of my work is that there's so much potential for growth with the child. You're birthing as a mother, right? You're birthing a child, and now you're a mother, and that's the birth of the mother. And this journey is so magical and mysterious at the same time. I do want to say that for some people, medication can really help, and I want people to keep an open mind to this because there is so much stigma around it. There's a lot of fear if you're breastfeeding, how's it going to affect my child? How will it affect me? Will I be dazed? Will I be a zombie? So many fears, but many women have found, and all the research has shown, there are many safe drugs to be using. It can be really effective alongside therapy. I always recommend therapy alongside if a mother is taking medication. So some examples, one client I worked with, she didn't use medication, but she was very anxious. She actually came to me for advice, asking for advice on how to parent a child. Her baby was only 6 weeks old. She had started asking about nurseries and sleep training and feeding. So you could pick up early on that she's always in her life been a high-achieving person, and she wanted to plan step by step what to do as a mother. And a part of me, the parent coach in me, wanted to give advice and tell her what to do for each step of the way. And, I, at the same time, was going through my own journey, so I was doing my own research. But the psychologist in me and the true me knew that she was probably struggling to just connect with her child and be present in the moment and not plan the future. So we did a lot of work on her anxiety, her fears. We got down to early life beliefs. We did a lot of meditation, things like that, just helped her really be present with her child, and that her anxiety really resolved in the first year.
Yes.
But I think there's just so many examples and so many ways it can go. It's so varied. Typically within the first year or 18 months, I think if a person is really putting in the work and finding what's right for them, we do see many of the symptoms resolve. But I do want to say that if it is postpartum depression or anxiety, that time itself doesn't resolve doesn't resolve what's going on, because we can become depressed about the next thing and the next thing, and the anxiety will be about the next thing. So it's really important to start working, doing your inner work to start addressing what the root is.
Okay, so before I get into my next question, I actually remember I have a friend who told me about her postpartum, I want to say depression, because she went through it for a good 6-7 months and she was not getting out of it. But I remember her saying this after she got out of it. I don't know how she did it. She didn't seek help, but I guess she was one of the lucky ones that kind of sort of got out of it by time. But she was saying that she would wake up every day wishing something would happen to her. Just naturally. She didn't want to hurt herself, but she could not get out of that mindset. And I remember her mentioning exactly what you just spoke about earlier. She had that struggle of cuddling a child and having them there 24/7 and caring for them all the time. She wasn't working at the time as well, so there wasn't like a disconnection or like a time of her day where she was stepping away. She was there 24/7. She didn't have help. She didn't have any of that. And I remember it was so difficult hearing that from her. It was heartbreaking. And as a person who will eventually think of, conceiving and having a child, it is something that I think about. So what is your advice for people like expecting mothers or people who are thinking of taking that step so that they're not worried going into it?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I guess when we're going through a journey like that, everyone has their own way of getting through it. There's so many ways to do inner work. We know that. We can do it through, yoga. We can do it through talking to a friend. We can do it with a professional. We can do it through, physical therapy. Whatever it is that for each person it is going to be different. I think it's very common that early life experiences will resurface, and that will be deep down the trigger that causes the difficulty with a child. And for example, with that person you're speaking about, I would think, what are relationships like for them? What's intimacy like for them? And I don't mean romantic necessarily, but just intimate closeness. What was it like with her parents? Because those things resurface, and if she chose in that moment that it wasn't the right time to consider help, she might notice that this comes up with other relationships, and at that point she might consider again, it doesn't have to be a psychologist, but there's some inner work that needs to be explored. So before a person gets pregnant, I always encourage, I think everyone can benefit from the inner work, inner healing, the journey of discovering, who am I really? We have an inner critic inside of us. Women do, and I think it's really common in this region. We work with many Arabs, and we work with many people from Eastern countries as well, where there's very high expectations on women. And women are not meant to have any of their own needs. We're supposed to be perfect. And,
exactly.
and most times I ask moms, like, what do you think the perfect mother is? They say, well, a mother doesn't get angry, or a mother who is just able to always be there for their child. And it's almost like this
They're
woman,
not human.
Yeah, there's no humanity. Who is this person? They're not a person. And that's really unhelpful for a child, actually. It's really helpful for a mother to reorient and remember being a person is what your child needs, being a whole person. So again, doing that inner work. So knowing there's this inner critic inside of me, get familiar with it, know when it's triggered, and practice not judging yourself. That's a really big part of it. So there's some kind of psychological things, I think, that are important. There's the practical things that are really important, like who's going to help you out. That's some people overlook it or expect again that I should be able to do it on my own. My mom did it alone.
Exactly.
I have to do it myself too. And in Dubai, we have many families who don't have their extended family. So who is it really who's going to be helping you out when you need a hand?
Exactly.
So thinking about your network, your community, your home environment, who's going to be around and not, and then psychologically getting. I think meditation, personally, I think it's the strongest thing that can shift our inner work, our inner dialogue from a place of tension and friction and sadness and anxiety to peace. And, again, with spirituality, meditation sometimes goes with spirituality. I think for some people, really grounding themselves in something spiritual can be moving.
Going into that a little more, I'm going to ask you your unique tell me why question, which is tell me why it's still taboo. Why is it still taboo for women to come forward? Why do women still think it's taboo to talk about their postpartum depression or their challenges, and they have to suffer in silence?
Well, I think there's as long as we have been aware, there's been pressure on women to be perfect, to be the center of our community, to be the carers of everyone but themselves. And ultimately, I think it comes back to shame, that because we can't meet these expectations, we feel ashamed. There's an idyllic mother who we create in our mind who provides and provides endlessly. And actually, we forget that we have our own needs and we can feel really low. And I think sometimes people believe that because I'm feeling low, it means I don't love my child, or I'm not a good mother, or I should be better, or it's embarrassing. They think I'm not happy. And, I can speak for myself. I think in the first year, I worked really hard to perform for other people too, to give off an appearance that I'm a good mother. And all of that comes back to, of course, there's the inner dialogue, but there's the cultural, the historic expectations on women, the blame we put on mothers for things, that makes it really hard to just speak openly about how difficult an experience is.
And sometimes we do that to ourselves. Like, we always set high expectations and for ourselves, not even for the people around us. So that must be affecting it.
And I think one of the things, social media, for example, has been, in a way, it's been great because information is out there. But at the same time, we're bombarded with images of perfection, of mothers doing it better than us. And that's really exhausting. And sleep training and all of these ideas about the way to do it. Again, as a psychologist, I'm like, I have this down. I know all the strategies. Until I got to it, I was like, oh my God, I can't do this because I have my own stuff and my own challenges.
Social media is a big one. I know all my friends who are mothers, they always talk about this. You always see these reels of a mother with 6 children doing it all, and her husband is super supportive, and it's just like this ideal perfect picture, picture perfect family. And it's just not real. And to be honest, it has affected them emotionally and psychologically, especially after they've just given birth and they feel like they can't cope with one child, and here they are looking at a video of a woman doing it with 6 children.
Definitely.
So it's important to remember that it's just not real, and that you need to be real with yourself. Okay, so if you were sitting in a room right now, and this is just a question that I thought of now because of the statistic that you mentioned at the very beginning. If you're sitting in a room right now, bearing in mind that 1 in 5 women actually suffer from postpartum depression, and there are like 30 women in the room, what would your advice be? These women haven't come forward. They haven't spoken about their challenges, but knowing that there will definitely be women in that room with challenges, what would your advice be to ease them into that?
So I think one of the things is the building of awareness with internal awareness. So I think the more we are aware of what's going on for us And by aware, I want to be very clear that we're not judging our experience. So I'm aware of the thoughts that go on in my mind or the sensations that come up in my body, but I'm not judging it as good or bad. Then they feel that really empowers a woman to be able to speak up, whether that's to a friend, to a colleague, to their gynecologist. Because the point where we get stuck is either the awareness is not there and they're experiencing physical symptoms and they don't know what it is, stomach aches, headaches, tension, or they're experiencing, again, like they've lost interest in everything, but they're not connecting that all of these experiences are connected to each other. So sometimes they're not necessarily aware of what's going on. Sometimes they're so judgmental of that experience that they're not willing to speak to anyone about it. So I think those are two really important barriers to encourage people to just speak to the people you trust, the people you love, your pediatrician, your gynecologist, whoever is there. The other thing I would say is to women, again at the psychological level, is get comfortable in the unknown. Get comfortable not knowing what the answer is. Many women, I think, who live in our community in Dubai, were women who came here to work or high achieving, who are always go doing in a busy city. But with motherhood, it's very different. A lot of it is about not knowing the answer and accepting that you don't know and that the answers will reveal themselves. And I can just be with what it is. So practicing that regularly.
That's really nice. I like that.
Yeah.
Getting comfortable with the unknown or the uncomfortable, basically.
Exactly.
Very nice.
With the uncertainty of what's
very
right.
nice. All right. So we talk about postpartum and its effects on women. How does it affect the man?
So men also do experience mood changes. I mean, of course, we have the physical side of what a woman goes through. Statistically, interestingly, they're saying about 8 to 10% of men may experience postpartum depression in the first year after their child is born. Again, a mother is going through a big shift, but so is a father. His life has totally changed. It's flipped upside down. And they might have experienced lots of changes in their relationship to their wife. So again, this is happening for men. They are experiencing it. It might look quite different. There might be a lot of restlessness, agitation. They might appear very indecisive. They might seem like workaholics, spending all their time at work. We also know that with men, even outside of the postpartum period, the way depression shows itself is quite different. Sometimes it just looks like anger, which is covering up sadness, confusion, things like that, because there's socially acceptable ways a man can show their feelings and there's socially acceptable ways a woman can show her feelings. So, but deep down, it might actually be something like depression. So men are less likely to ask for help, and that's very worrying because we know that outside of postpartum, we know that men are at higher risk for suicide, things like that, externalizing behavior, aggression, ending up in prison, things like that. But we are trying at the Lighthouse also, we're trying to be much more proactive about having a men's support group, doing things for fathers, things like that to make sure they feel included in this journey.
Mentioning support groups, that's a good, segue into the questions that we have here. We actually got a question from a listener asking, she's a 32-year-old who is saying, I've been doing well. I don't need to speak to a medical professional per se, but I would like to share my challenges with other mothers where we can support each other. Does that exist in Dubai, and where can I find them?
Yes. So there are lots of different communities and spaces for mothers, which is so lovely. And there are really good forums online that give you an updated list. So I would consider, if it's non-clinical, I would consider things like coffee mornings. They have mom coffee mornings. They have mom meditation groups. There are, messy play activities for children, but the mothers sit together and have tea. So there's lots of activities. Just Googling it actually will give lots of answers. Nice. We used to, at the Lighthouse, have a postnatal mental health support group online. I used to run that. It was about 2 years ago.
Okay.
We actually stopped that group, and I'll explain why, and we started something else in its place. So the thing with that group is, firstly, I think for a mother in the first few months, it's really hard to find the time, designated time to go to a support group, to, get dressed, and some don't want to appear on camera, some do, and the baby's crying, no schedule, things like that. So there was a bit of a barrier with people making use of the group. And what we realized is we wanted to create a one-to-one space for a mother to be able to share what she's going through and essentially screen her well-being. So it's not a clinical intervention. It's more like a well-being check. So it's just any average person who is pregnant or has had a baby in the past year, they come up to the Lighthouse, they have this postnatal or prenatal well-being check, and it's just an hour to speak to a psychologist, and they can give you some resources. They can just screen what's been going on for you, give you some advice on how to move forward. So that's a one-to-one space. But like I said, there are different clinics and also non-clinical spaces for mothers that exist in Dubai, and I really encourage moms to make use of this because it's so important to feel connected.
Of course. And I feel like I've seen this with my friends who are mothers when they sit together and one of them mentions something and they go, oh my gosh, me too. I just experienced that last week. It makes them feel so much better just talking about it and just knowing that someone else is also going through the same thing, and that it helps with the self-shame because it helps you feel at ease, like, okay, I'm okay. It's fine. This is normal.
Exactly.
Okay, so our next question is also a good one. And I think we did cover it briefly in the beginning, but maybe we can answer it as well. Also anonymous, because a lot of our listeners wanted to stay anonymous. I've been feeling down since I gave birth 2 months ago. I always read about postpartum depression, but I'm not sure if I should seek help now or wait it out. Who do I go to and what do I say?
Yeah.
This is actually a really good question. How do I start? Like, what do I tell them?
Yes. Well, I think the first thing is, many times it's wonderful that this person has been willing to speak up and consider whether this is right for them or not. One thing to consider is just booking an appointment with a psychologist. I did that when I was pregnant, and I'm so glad that I did, because I think that everyone's experience is so different, and there's a very fine line between what's clinical versus what's just a struggle, but there's no harm. If she's able to book an appointment with a psychologist, I'd encourage her to, and not to worry about what to say, because the psychologist will ask all the questions.
We'll draw it out.
They'll draw it out, they'll help you, they'll guide you as needed, and it might just be that's a one-off, or they might suggest working on some things together.
All right, we've kept you for so long. Thank you so much for your time. Are there any closing remarks that you'd like to end with?
I think just a general statement to women out there to make use of the people in your community, to connect with each other, and to work as hard as possible on not judging yourselves. We're all here together. We all go through hardship, and we all, value each other and what each of us brings. So, just a message of connection to women out there, everything you're going through.
That's very sincere. Thank you so much, Dr. Summer. Thank you guys for listening. If you have any questions, we will always love to have Dr. Summer back on the show. Send us your questions on podcasts@gulfnews.com. We'll be sure to have them answered, and we'd love to have Dr. Summer back on the show. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.